Ryan, we're just going to get started right away. Let's just jump into it. Give this a shot. Here are the starting principles. What does it mean to listen? Let's just have a general conversation because we want to break this down to basics. Almost like when we're in kindergarten, we go like the things that make me successful in life I learned in kindergarten. Listen. What does it mean to listen to customers? Why is that important, Ryan?
Oh, well, because at the end of the day, they are the customer, right? Like if we're just trying to unidirectionally push stuff to them, we may eventually stumble across it, but they give us the answers that we need, right? At the end of the day, we're solving problems for them. We're creating transformations for them. So who better to hear from than the customer, what that should look like, what it needs to feel like, what the precipitating challenges are, why they need it in the first place, and under what conditions, emotional state, mental state, financial state that they'll be willing to engage with us and do what we need them to do, which is to pay us to make their lives better.
And at the end of the day, that's who we're selling to. Question though, Ryan, is how do founders get sidetracked and listen to the wrong things?
Well, in a lot of cases, I think some of it comes from fear, right? Which is back to that, I don't want to hear that my baby's ugly thing, which is easily avoided, right? I talk about this all the time, and I don't have my copy to hold up today because I handed it off to another founder. I don't know how many times I've given that book away, that specific copy. I've given it away and it's come back to me. All right.
Oh,
always
nice.
with big thanks. You know what I'm going to start doing? I'm going to start instituting a new policy. I'm going to give it, when you give it back to me, you have to give me 2 copies so I can double the number I'm putting on these. The mom test is what I'm talking about.
I like
the mom test. So I think there's this fear of, I'm going to go tell people, what I have, and they might not like it. Yeah, they might not. But if instead you ask them about their problems, you talk to them about all the challenges that they have in the context of the thing that you want to solve for, all of a sudden, whether it matters, how important it is, where it fits in that overall hierarchy of needs, and you don't have to be scared of that anymore. Right. So I think fear is definitely one of the things that slows us down as founders. Some of it is just we get so caught up in thinking through the problem. And in the early stages, we get into that mode. And like any muscle, the more we flex it, the stronger it gets, and the more like we ought to just keep using it. And so I think at those early stages where it's just like we get so used to the idea that it is just an idea, that it just stays an idea. Right? I'm just like, I'll just think my way through this instead of just having a 5-minute conversation with an actual human that suffers from this and going, hey, what's your experience?
I'm going to totally support that. I think founders listen to their own minds, and the longer they get used to that voice as they're hacking away, staying up at night, they get into that confirmation bias and create that really tight echo chamber and say, it sounded great. I'd be my own customer. I think this is great. And so they listen to themselves.
You know what's a bit funny about that? And you're absolutely right. And it does happen. The thing that's funny to me about that is there's a point for me where when I become intimate enough in my knowledge of who my customer is, there's this sort of secondary period where that can start to happen again. Let me explain what I mean. So in the very beginning, I drink my own Kool-Aid. I go out, I start talking to customers, I gather feedback, I start to understand who they are, what they need, what they want, what their problems are. And then I start to build based on that, right? But then there comes this interesting point where then like we hit another challenge. Instead of going back to the customers, I do this, lots of other founders do this. Because we've become so intimate with the customers, we start having these made up conversations in our head, right?
Right. Yep.
They start to feel really real because I do know the customers really well. Right? So sometimes that separation of reality, I actually asked somebody this the other day, and it turns out it was a hallucination. You'll know this founder very well. It's a founder we both know and love within Startups.com. I was talking to her. I was like, oh, but it's like we talked about last time when we said what said. And like, she's like, we never had that conversation. I was like, oh, but we must have. She's like, I didn't explain this particular part of the problem to you until an email 2 days ago. And you said when we talked last week, we didn't. I'm like, oh, weird, because I totally remembered it. Right. So I think, again, it is definitely important to get to know your customers, but always be willing to go back to them. No matter how well you think you know them, always be willing to go back to them.
Ryan, you do regular workshops on getting customers. Yep. How often does this happen for you? Because it happens to me all the time. A founder will come up and say, do you think I should do this? Or do you think I should do that? Or what pricing should it be? Or should I offer this package? And I say, I think we should ask your customers. I have no idea. And it's not that I can't make an educated guess, but I'm trying to teach them, go to your customers.
Pause on that, because you will make an educated guess.
Yes.
You will get an answer. That's actually the problem. Asking a question like that is setting yourself up for disaster. It's the same thing. Again, going back to the mom test, is one of the things that Rob teaches in that book is not to ask forward-looking questions, because you're asking people for an answer that they cannot possibly accurately provide you. You are asking them to lie to you simply because it's the only thing they can do, because they've got to make up an answer. They got to make up a guess. And we will. I always answer that question in kind of the same way, Ed, which is absolutely. I can tell you what to do. Do this. It's like, great. Now we have a data point of 1. How many points does it take to draw a line so we know which direction to go?
Oh,
at least one more. So I'm like, yes, I can answer that question for you. Will it have any validity? Absolutely not. Will it help you? Probably not.
We're not trying to pass the buck. We're
No.
just trying to teach the habits that you need.
We're trying to make sure that you're actually asking the right people, right? Now, if I happen to be your ICP, yes, you can ask me and yes, I can answer. And that's still one data point. So you need to go talk to 15 or 20 more of me. That's a horrifying thought, isn't it? Can you imagine 15 or 20 more of me?
That's a lot of dots and points and lines. Okay, but Ryan, I'm going to push this a little further because we talk about the things in our head that we're listening to, sort of the loops, and it could be fear-based, could be our own, cognitive bias, confirmation bias, recency bias, all sorts of different things. Optimism, we could be listening to that a little too much. But I always tell founders, listen, you have to literally empty your mind of your preconceived notions and your assumptions. Let's talk about how do you actually do that? Like, we know what it means to listen, but what's some principles that we can go in before we're talking to some customers just to position ourselves to listen better?
Do you remember what you did right when you got on this call, Ed?
I don't remember.
You cleared your mind. You cleared your mind. You've got to clear your mind. You have to clear your mind. Why do we have to clear our mind? Because if we bring to this any preconceived notions, if we are applying any type of filter to the information they're giving us, the validity of what we take away from that is going to be hugely in question. There have actually been times where I have punted off the responsibility of doing the customer interviews specifically because I didn't want to bias them. When it's something that was like too near and dear to me, I said like, look, I'm too close to this. Can you talk to? So either co-founder, employee, advisor, someone else. I need somebody to gather some objective feedback for me, and I'm having a hard time remaining objective. One of the things that we see happen all the time in listening, it's a twofold problem. You're not really listening. You actually end up doing a lot of the talking, which is horrible.
Right.
And you steer the responses. It's a very dangerous thing. And this is what I was having a conversation, pretty tough conversation with a founder on Monday. And the conversation was as follows. They had already built a solution. They had an MVP. They had a prototype. It worked. It did things. And now they wanted to go figure out who needed it. Right. You and I, from hard experience, both know the problem of being the solution that's running around looking for the problem. This founder did not.
Totally. Yeah.
And so it was now my responsibility, as I see it, to make them understand the danger in that. And the challenge was, as I explained it, like, look, you will go out and you'll start talking to people, and you will eventually, you talk to enough people, two things happen. You might stumble across the one edge case that needs you. Even worse, you become so good at manipulating the conversations and biasing the responses that you start to hear exactly what you need to hear. And then you go build it. You go raise money. You go start to sell it. And then it doesn't work. You don't find product market fit. You find yourself in an endless set of pivots, and you're dead in the water. All right?
Our colleague, Will, you and I, we work with him every day. He has this habit, and it leads to a question. He'll message me and just say, tell me again how our customers are acting, or tell me again your experience. And it's like we've had this conversation maybe 30 times earlier, but he'll say, I just want to make sure that we're not building something that nobody wants or nobody cares. And so then I think that's a great habit. My question to you, Ryan, how much doubt should we have? Like, do we walk into these conversations going, I could totally be wrong about this? In fact, I'm expecting to be wrong about this. How do we set ourselves up? Clear mind, but then positioning.
I just saw somebody post something about this yesterday, and it is a more famous quote. It wasn't this individual. I don't remember exactly how. I'm going to slaughter the quote, but the basic thing is, in order to be foolproof, assume you're the fool.
Yes.
Right. Which is to say, you should walk into, like, as founders, it is so difficult. We have to be the eternal optimists. We have to believe in what we're doing. We have to do that. But before we can really build that belief and that optimism on anything concrete, the concrete foundation has to come from skepticism. We have to be skeptical about everything we're doing. And if we approach it that way and we ask our questions through that skeptical lens, the problem is we so desperately want somebody to want our solution. That we lean into those parts of it. If instead we approach it and say, like, I want, if you absolutely want to make sure that your idea is good, be as pessimistic about it as you possibly can be. Right. I love it. Downplay it. Let them lean in. Right. Because if you keep pulling on them, eventually you're going to get somebody to lean in. Eventually you'll find somebody to lean in. If you keep pulling, somebody will lean. Don't do that. Don't do that.
We have some really great questions to follow up with that, but let's look at the principles here. So we're talking about the principles. What does it mean to listen? My next question, then how do we take, that's spelt wrong, my apologies. How do we take what we hear and learn? Let's just give some general principles. So we've gone out, we've asked people, and we've got all these opinions, and maybe we've done it. Let's just say we use the mom test. We've been emptied the toolkit, preconceived notion. We're skeptical. But then what happens after that? Do you just start hacking away, or is there a process? What do you do, Ryan?
So the very first thing I'm going to do is again, let's assume we've done everything right. And what we've gathered is some objective feedback. We now understand, and this will vary based on stage. Let's say we're at the early stage. We're still validating the idea. because I think it matters. And this will make it easier to contextualize the response. We're at that early stage. We've got a bunch of feedback around what their problems are. We've got a bunch of feedback around what they've currently tried and why they're still dissatisfied, right? All those things that we're trying to discover at that early adopter validation stage. At this point, what I'm really trying to do is rank order those things. I'm trying to understand what of this feedback is most important, which one of these things, because at the end of the day, we can't just create an average of all the feedback and move towards that. No such thing exists.
Exactly.
We have to pick. Let's just pretend you and I are now a sale and it's 1441. You and I have just set off the coast. We've got a sextant in hand. We have to let the stars guide us. You got to pick one.
Sure.
You got to pick a star.
Yep.
You have to pick a direction and a vector to follow. And so the first step is to try to understand of the feedback you've received, which is the most compelling. It goes back to this thing when I'm talking to founders, and sometimes I'll find them trying to validate things. And I'll ask like, okay, how did you decide on this? Well, we heard this might be a problem. Okay, cool. What were some of the other problems? What are some of the other challenges?
That's good.
Well, there's this other one. It's really big. And it's this thing like, okay, so if that's the biggest thing they're facing, then why isn't that what we're focused on? Or if I'm saying like, what do you think the absolute biggest assumption within your business model is? That's the thing you got to go focus on. Whatever gets called into question about what you're about to do, whatever the biggest one is, there's a binary. Like if this turns out to be true, we have a business. If this turns out to be false, we don't. That's what I'm seeking.
But Ryan, is your stack ranking, how you prioritize, is that based on frequency, how loud the customer talks about? Is it strategic? Like, give us a little more in terms of how you actually prioritize.
Frequency is definitely part of it. If I see frequency, I see high frequency, but I don't see quantification, for example.
Okay.
Let's just say I see frequency like, yep, that's a problem for me. And I hear everybody say that's a problem for me. Let's just say I interview 50 people.
Okay.
I interview 50 people, and let's say 40 of them said I have that problem, but there's no quantification of it. Let's say I drilled in on it. There just really isn't a quantification. They don't know what it costs them in money, time, lost opportunities, whatever. Out of those same 50 people, there was another problem that was raised by only 10 or 15 of the people, let's say 15, but they were able to highly quantify it and talk about why it's important to them, what it's costing them, and what the solution would be worth. This is far more valuable and actionable feedback for me. Right? I can set my sales to that star.
Nice.
Right?
Yep.
I can do that. When it's not quantified, I'm taking a risk because I might build something. Because again, they're saying, yes, I have that problem. Right? That exists for me. But if I don't know how big of a problem, how expensive a problem, how important of a problem it is, what's the silly thing I always say about I walk into your house with a pipe wrench because you got a leaky faucet. I'm like, I'm here with the pipe wrench, Ed. And you're like, cool, get out of the way. The fire department's here. We got to put the roof out.
Exactly.
Right? I don't want to take the risk of having a non-quantified problem that I don't know whether they're going to be willing to jump through all the hoops to solve it are going to be.
How fair is it to say then the ones that show you the shortest path to sales or traction sort of weight or like weigh are rating much more?
It's a big one. It's a big one, actually. So the distance to satisfaction is really important.
Gotcha.
Right? If you set out to solve a massive problem, I'll pick on a category here, and sorry for anybody listening that's in this category, employee engagement. Okay.
Fun.
Very difficult to sell, very difficult to get. Here's why. The horizon, the distance to satisfaction, the typical way they will measure, one of the ways that they love to measure employee engagement, because it's one of the ways that companies will ask them to show, they're like, well, why do you want to have higher employee engagement? We want to improve our retention. Okay, cool. What's your typical turnover? About 3.5 years. Cool. So we'll start today, and you and I will know sometime after 3.5 years whether we've succeeded. This is why it's so hard to sell, right? It's worse than SEO. It's harder to sell than SEO. Like, I need you to do a bunch of work on spec, and then we're going to wait to see if it drives traffic. And then we're going to wait to see if that traffic was worth having in the first place.
Oh, man.
Ouch. Right? So we want to avoid this. So yes, the distance to satisfaction is really important. Sometimes you can take a big problem and break it down into little pieces. Very few big problems have I met that didn't have important problem milestones along the way that had value in their own solution. So when we can break that down and say, like, look, what I want to do is stop forest fires. Cool. Let's stop forest fires. What are some of the constituent problems that lead up to that? All right. Trash along highways, or where we've located highways, or the fact that we've diverted water sources. What are some other things what are other little problems that we could solve that will help us with the big piece so that we can get to satisfaction that much faster?
Right. And it's almost like that could be your mini beachhead that gets you to those other things.
It's exactly what it is. And that's why when I'm looking for early adopters, my early adopter curve is, they're aware of the problem. They've actively sought solutions. They've actively tried solutions or are actively using a solution. And 4, they're still dissatisfied. And it's the description and quantification of that dissatisfaction that becomes my window of opportunity. It may not be all that I build. I actually might want to build a big chunk of what those other people that they're still dissatisfied with the build, because it's part of the total solution. But I know that my unique opportunity is that piece that they haven't built, that place where they're still dissatisfied. That's often the beachhead. That I gained from listening.
Perfect segue. Let's talk about building. We're still on this topic of how do we take what we hear and learn from it and what to do next. Ryan, and I'm just looking at our audience, and I know, and founders out there, you fall in this trap. You hear this feedback and you're like, yes. And sure, maybe you prioritize and all those things, but then how you put that into action, a lot of founders go out and they start building. And I like to say, Ryan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Now you have an assumption that what you're going to build is going to solve for that piece of feedback, address it. Now treat it like an assumption and go back to testing. So maybe not build that whole feature that you're sure that people want, but now how do we test it? Because large companies do this all the time, Ryan. Like Facebook, I remember Facebook, X, all these companies would say, we launched a new feature and I haven't received it yet. Why?
Yeah.
Because they're testing it with a very small part of the population.
Limited rollout.
Exactly. So I say, even if you know what you want, still be in the mindset, this is just an assumption and I'm going to test it.
Yep. You have to be testing. And you want to test with as low fidelity, low friction ways you can to this point of testing. So even big companies, to your point, Facebook has all the behavioral data they could possibly need to make a decision. Did they just make the decision? No, they put it out and they do a limited rollout and they test it. I learned something today. Actually, I was able to have lunch with a local founder who does, in addition to some of their tech stuff, is they have some retail stuff they do. And they got onto PriceSmart's shelves, but with the green sticker. And I didn't know what that meant, but the green sticker are items that they are testing that weren't bought by their buyers. They're like very localized testing that they do.
Gotcha.
Right. So even a company that size that has billions and billions and billions of dollars annually in transactions to be able to determine what we should do does this. So if you think as a startup that somehow you have a crystal ball that will help you see past the lack of data, you're wrong, right? I have a crystal ball that tells me you're wrong. I'm sure of it. So you build as little as you can. And what do you build towards? Go back to the thing we were just talking about. It was those micro outcomes. What is the smaller piece? What's the first thing we can get them to do with us where they'll go, aha, mission accomplished. Doesn't matter how small that mission is, as long as it's meaningful enough that they feel some level of transformation or progress towards the transformation, that they want more. Think of what you do at the early stages as the appetizer, right?
Gotcha.
The appetizer has to indicate to me that there's quality there, that it's going to make me want more, and that I want to keep going, right? It's a sample size, a trial, it's whatever metaphor you want to use here. But we want to make it something that is as easy for us to deliver. And again, that value horizon, that point to satisfaction, the distance between those 2 points is as short as possible at the early stages. So we're not wasting time, right? If I pick something, and I did, 100 years ago when I was building my agency, Will and I laugh at these things all the time. The satisfaction cycle was, if ever, right? Because we were just building these massive, crazy projects. It was like a year before we would finish. And so that's when you would find out, like, okay, now we've built all this web tech for you, and now we're going to launch it. And now we're going to find out if you're satisfied, right? Now I would approach that entirely differently. We'd build micro tools. We'd build micro-sites. We would compile lots of little things on the way to that bigger journey so that we're sure we're building the right thing, that we're going to get to satisfaction, all that stuff. We learn way faster. This is important, so important for startup founders, because when we take in that feedback and we believe that we understand it, the very first thing we really want to do after that rank prioritization, all that stuff, the next thing we want to do is validate it. We want to make sure that we were right about the way we interpreted that by delivering a result that matches what we were told.
Right.
And then making sure that they're still excited about that.
You're saying continue to be skeptical, carry that skepticism through so that you validate, trust but verify.
Trust but verify.
Also, moving slow tends to contribute the best to growing very, very fast exponentially later on once you nail it. Perfect.
Exactly.
Okay, so I got one more principle that I want to look at is then how does that help us get more customers? Before, I want to couch this, Ryan. It's going to be natural that if we go listen to customers, we put what they say to us in practice, we learn from it, then we're going to create features that are going to create more customer satisfaction and the product's going to continue to sell. But Ryan, I specifically want to ask you, how do we use the fact that we're talking to customers before we go out and build and everything like that? How can we leverage that to go out and get more customers?
Lots and lots of different ways, actually. But I think the first few really important ones are, once we've gotten a couple customers, we now know what that cadence looks like. Here were the emotional triggers that we pushed. Here was the feedback we received. Here were the objections that we had to handle. Here was the process of onboarding, all of that stuff, right? In the beginning, that's all learnings, right? So we're listening, we're understanding. So we're listening throughout the process, right? This is just something we do before we start selling. In fact, it is just as important. I've primarily been talking about customers we don't yet have, but it is also just as important to listen to the customers that we do, right? Because they're going to teach us by virtue of the fact that they fell through the sieve, right? They were the ones that made it, or they were the ones that got, however you want the metaphor to work, they were the ones that got caught in the sieve. Everybody else fell through. They were the ones that stuck around. They became customers. So we want to understand everything we can about them and what makes them different than everybody else so that we can try to replicate those conversations, those people, those outcomes. That's one.
Number one.
Yep.
How do you actually do that? I try and build like an avatar, a customer story. I try and catalog everything and codify them and basically build a character sheet, if we're talking geeky Dungeons and Dragons type thing.
Yeah.
How else can we do that? Learn everything that we can about them, and then what do we do with that information?
Well, you do exactly that. You learn everything you can about them, right? If we can get to their full THACO, right, for the Dungeons and Dragon nerds out there, that's what we do, right? We want to understand their exact stats. And then we look for more of those, right? So we're trying to fingerprint. How we do that will depend a little bit on the type of business you run.
Okay.
You and I spent time over the last couple of weeks talking about why building a service-based offering is a great precursor to building a product. That's part of it, right? The minute you build product, your ability to see, learn, listen. Sometimes the customers know we're listening to them. Sometimes they don't, right? Looking at behavioral analytics is a version of listening to your customers, watching how they interact with your software, watching how they interact with your app.
Right.
That's a version of listening. Looking at feedback throughout a service process is a version of listening, whether we were overtly asking questions or just gathering feedback, all of that. That's part of listening. So depending on what you're delivering, who you're delivering it to, the price, lots of things, right? Because clearly you're not going to sit down and talk to every $3.99 app download, right? You can't afford to.
Sure.
You'd be losing money on every single one. They also probably don't want to talk to you, right? Not enough in it for them either.
Right.
So, but you can gather some feedback no matter what your price point is, but certainly like the degree to which you get to. So, but if you're running a high price service business, part of what you're doing is constantly talking to and learning from your customers, right? And then it's then that type game, right? When we do this, this happens and we like it, do more. When we do this, this happens, we don't like it, do less. Find a way to avoid that. Find a way to drive to a different outcome with the users. The other side of that is that we now have case study, right? I think that one of the most important things that we get out of existing customers and listening to them is both the story to be told and how to tell it, right? Because I think one of the things that ends up happening is I see so much bad case study written because it's written from the perspective of the seller. It's written from the perspective of the company.
Sure.
We did this for the company. 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 That's you're talking to yourself at that point. Not important, right? How did the user feel? What did they go through? Right. So I think if you get to a point, here's a great pro tip, actually. If you get to the end of a client engagement and you can't tell the story from their side, you have not listened to your customers enough.
Ooh, that hurts, man. That hits.
It does. And I'm definitely guilty of it on a regular basis.
Right.
But I take notice of it. And then I go back and I say, okay, I need to back up. I need to pay a little more attention. I need to go and ask some questions. And I'll be honest, those questions are best asked as we're going.
Sure.
Another pro tip, if case study is in your future, start it now, right? The worst thing is to try to listen after the fact. So when we did this, how did you feel? Let me go back 3 months and try to remember.
Exactly.
Right?
And document as you ask. Let me explore this point, and then you've got other points I want to get into. But first, case studies, everyone, I can't recommend this even more. It creates an artifact for you to show other prospects. So that's fantastic. But Ryan, I see founders do this all the time. The grass always looks greener. So let's say they nailed one customer, they've got a good one, and great, and they're super excited. But then it's like, oh, but that other customer has more money. I'm doing this for small business right now, but if I could just land that big, medium enterprise with 300 employees for employee engagement tool, then it's going to go so much better. And so I find founders start to divert themselves and kind of get a little waylaid on this road here.
They do. They were like, all right, we're following that star. And then you get halfway through the journey and you're like, but what about that one? Right? And look, at some points you want to expand your concentric circles, right? If you started with your early adopter population, like we always suggest you do, and you went very niche, very focused, at some points you're probably going to have to start to expand beyond that. I think the challenge is, as you described it, when we take a hard right turn and we take it too soon and at the expense of doing what's already worked. Like the way I will typically ask this question when I just really need to hit home is, so you want to take what was working, chuck that out the window and try something that hasn't yet.
Exactly. Yep.
And they go, well, no, but... And then eventually they agree with me, right? And look, I'll tell them, like, look, there's a time and a place for that. And we may want to push, but is now the time? Is now the place, right? Or should we keep repeating what's worked, right? Because it's my whole diatribe that I go off on about efficiency versus effectiveness.
Right.
Right. You've got a customer who did something that was effective. You look at that customer and go, okay, but they're a $10,000 customer. They would be a $100,000 customer. That would be 10 times more efficient. If you can get them, right? If you can get them. And if everything else holds true, right? Sometimes we just don't know anything else about those folks yet. We know they might have a better ability to pay, or they're much larger. Based on the way we price, they would be worth more money to us. We don't necessarily know what else comes with that because we've never sold to one like that. So at the early stages, in my opinion, just always stick with effectiveness and slowly work your way into what efficiency looks like once you have something you can scale.
How many times have we heard startups accidentally stumble into the perfect customer for them that they never initially thought about targeted in the first place?
Yeah, it does happen. It does happen. So it's all to say that, like, at the very beginning, we're just this giant stack of assumptions.
Right.
And one by one, we just need to start proving them true or false. And again, we need to continue to be skeptical and say that, like, okay, what I've learned up until now is what I've learned up until now, right? I know that this was the best customer type out of the ones I've experienced so far.
Right.
Right. But again, then you got to be careful that you're not doing the shiny ball, grass is greener type scenario where it's just like I'm constantly jumping and chasing. Like, at some point, once we start to see something be effective, do 80% that and spend 20% of your thought cycles, time, money, whatever, on the speculative stuff.
We've been talking about how does that help us get more customers as we use these principles. Ryan, you just walked us through one point. What are some other things that would answer? You had some other things you want to add.
Testimonial is another one. I mean, it's not the same as case study. Just visibility, right? Other people talking about us, word of mouth starts to happen, data starts to happen, right? The minute you can say, our last 10 clients experienced this, that's way better than we can help you do, right? All of a sudden, you've got a body of work and evidence that goes a long way. And again, if you were listening throughout the process and you were documenting throughout the process, you will now be able to speak very clearly to those points from the consumer perspective, from your customer's perspective, right? In their voice, from where they sit, the way they feel about it, what's keeping them up at night, and how that's relevant to that. Do I have time for like a 1 minute anecdote?
Yes, for sure. I got one to follow right after.
This happened 5-6 weeks ago now. We have a founder who was selling to founders, okay, and has a solution, works, does good things, but is selling to Series A funded founders and beyond, right? They need funded founders for their solution to make any sense. And they have a solution. They validated it by going out and talking to people about what the problems were, but they talked about just the problems related to what they were doing, right? So this is actually one of those pipe wrench problems. And then, because they weren't really listening to everything else that was going on in the context of these startups, they missed the fact that these Series A funded founders, yes, they had the problem that he solved. They had a bigger problem. The bigger problem was Series B, right? We now have 12 to 24 months to go open up that next round and close that round.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was their biggest problem. By understanding that and listening to it, he didn't have to change his product. He didn't have to change the problem that he solved. He had to recontextualize it. And by being able to show, finding somebody to say yes, getting that customer, and then listening and showing how it changed things, he was able to show, by using our solution, you will be able to do a better job of selling your traction to your next investors.
Good one.
Product was exactly the same. Outcome was exactly the same. Context and description, just the way it was framed, shifted. And now it's working. Now it's moving. Now he's selling.
It's amazing, Ryan. So many founders have got great products. They've got problem solution fit, but that's different than product market fit.
Yep.
And if they just tweak something, a little lever, just something, it has to be 1 degree change, everything can change.
That's it. He just had to reposition it in the context. He didn't have to change. He didn't have to become, I got to find a bigger problem to solve. Nope. Solve that problem, but connect it to the biggest problem they have, which had to come from listening. It had to come from getting a customer. It had to come from demonstration, and then telling new customers, this is what we can do for you.
That's a great story. Let me share a pro tip in my story as well. When I was initially doing founder-led sales, and I'm out there, and I hadn't even gotten a customer yet, but I had talked to a bunch of customers.
Yep.
One time I was in this sales, and I said, oh yeah, and just by accident, I mentioned their competitor, that I was talking to their competitor. And I said, yeah, I heard from so-and-so here. And I was like, oh, darn. And the potential customer said to me, you're talking to so-and-so? And I said, yeah, I've had conversations with them. And I kind of, didn't explain exactly where we were, but I said, we're working on how we could work together, and I'm learning a lot from them. And then immediately the conversation completely opened up, right? And they started saying, who else are you talking to? I said, I plan to talk to everybody. And what I realized is that even before I have customers, if I share with people I'm talking to that I'm talking to other people with their problems, and I say, this is what I'm learning, this is common, how about you? Man, does that ever open up so many opportunities to sell?
It does. It does. And just a very nuanced point within that is that part of what it does is give them permission to tell you that they also have that problem. Right? Sometimes, especially the early stages, when we're an unknown, unproven startup company trying to solve a problem for somebody, they may not want to admit to us that they have that problem, right? Sometimes ego gets in the way. Sometimes just secrecy gets in the way. But if they know, like, you're out there talking to everybody else in their industry and that this is a common problem, all of a sudden, sometimes they're not even aware, right? We deal with this a lot more in the startup space. And this, like, everybody thinks that the problem that they're having is the only time it's ever existed. They're the biggest idiot in the world, and no one else has ever suffered from this. I alone have this problem, and I alone am the only one that can't figure out how to solve it. Until I talk to literally any other founder, and they all go, yeah, me too. right? So sometimes there's just that aspect. But again, that comes from listening. It comes
Right.
from listening so that you can feed back to them that you have now discovered this thing, right? You're seeing this over and over and over, hearing this all the time,
You
which
triggered another anecdote
triggers
for
another
me.
thought.
Yeah,
Yeah.
another thought for me. One of the ways that I sell to CEOs all the time when I was doing executive coaching, employee engagement, HR, type stuff, I would say, I would just let them know because I was listening. I said, being the CEO is the loneliest position in the company.
Yeah.
And I would just
Zero
empathize.
peers.
Exactly. The fact that I listened allowed me to empathize and then gave me something to say that automatically made them trust me. And it was so much easier to sell.
That's it.
It's
That's
what
it.
you do.
That listening, what happens when you provide feedback to somebody, even if it's from having listened to someone else, they now know something about you. You're a good listener. People like to talk to good listeners, whether we know it or not. Psychology and consumer psychology in particular says if we believe that somebody's trustworthy and a good listener, we are way more likely to talk to them and tell them what they want to hear.
I want to wrap up this segment here. We're talking about the principles of listening and learning to help us get more customers. We've walked through these three. Ryan, if you had to summarize, every founder that watches this, who's here, what should they do next? Like, what are the main things? If they just give them haunting, enduring value that is going to be actionable and just give a return on investment for the rest of their lives, what would you tell them?
Is it okay if it's a little painful?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Regardless of what stage you're at, lean back and ask yourself, of the things that I believe right now about my startup company, about the direction we're going, about the product, about who the customer is, about how it should work and what we need to build, how much of that came from listening versus your own thinking and creation? Ask yourself that and really back up and say, regardless of how far down this path I am, if it turns out at any point from idea validation through that it was based on my own beliefs, aggregated learnings, my own creation versus truly listening to my users, that I should go back and revisit those things, regardless of what stage I'm at.
Right. No matter how much money you're making, how many customers you have. In fact, I know a founder, part of Startups.com. He told me in 20 some odd years, something like that, his startup wasn't just massively exploding. He was in this mindset of always listening and was doing about $7 million a year. Not bad. You could say after
business.
20 years, not a startup anymore, right?
Yeah.
But he said it was during COVID. I was talking about after COVID, and he said, I lost so much business. But the fact that I always go back and I listen to the feedback and what else they're struggling with during COVID, I was able to come up with other products or different ways that I could just pivot a few service offerings that I didn't lose any business. And in the 20 some odd years, he's never laid off a single employee. And he loves that. That's his dream. He wanted to do that.
It speaks to a whole bunch of different interesting points around what it is to be a founder. But like from a listening perspective, it's amazing that we will hear things like, we started this thing. There's a lot of this. We hear a lot of this around the COVID thing. We started this right before COVID, right? And then because of that, everything blew up, right? And then it got really difficult, and it's getting a little easier now, or whatever. And I'll always ask, like, so what did you change? Nothing really. We just started like, okay, so you're telling me that things got difficult because the world fundamentally shifted away from what it was, and there was massive upheaval and change across the board. And you didn't think to go back and revisit and talk to your customers again and find out, like, hey, what else has changed? Are we still valid? Are we still relevant? Are we still right? And it doesn't take a cataclysmic event like that. Just look at things like how vocabulary shifts from our parents to us to our kids, or even multiple times within a generation, right? The way I talked when I was 15 isn't the way I talked when I was 25, 35, 45. So it's so important to go back and listen on repeat, things that you already knew. Because I think there's a big challenge within founders. Like, even if they're doing it right and they're validating, they're going out and they're learning from others, they're learning from listening. That's what you knew, not what you know.
Right. Perfect.
It changes.
Yeah.
Changes all the time. We live in a very dynamic world. And especially like for any founder that's working with other founders, like if you sell to startups, if there's an industry that moves faster than we do, tell me about it, please. I'd love to hear about it. Right. And so like you have to constantly be revisiting. Just imagine like solutions that would have been interesting to us 5 years ago.
Oh, my word.
We wouldn't even look at now because of how much AI and machine learning have changed things.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. I go obsolete every 3 months, Ryan.
Yeah.